Welcome to the fourth panel of today's program, our fourth and last panel, and welcome to those who are joining us on the webcast. The panel is on professional ethics and dissent. Our major paper will be given by Colonel Retired Don Snider. Our commentators will be Lieutenant General Gregory Newbold and Peter Hegseth. For the benefit, everybody in the audience knows you have the bios in your paper, so I'm not going to go over them in detail, but just briefly for our webcast audience, Don Snider is now at the Strategic Studies Institute at the Army War College after a distinguished career at West Point. He had a very distinguished career in the active Army, serving in Vietnam on numerous tours, and ultimately concluding his active duty career serving on the staff of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's written prolifically, and his studies now focus on civil-military relations, the identities and development of the American officer, and the military profession. Peter Hegseth is probably the junior member of our faculty to join us today, having been commissioned from Princeton in 2003. He served with distinction in Baghdad in numerous capacities, and he presently also serves as the executive director of Vets for Freedom, an organization dedicated to mobilizing veterans to explain the American strategy in Iraq. General Newbold is presently a partner in the Torch Hill Investment Partners and is a managing partner as of January of 2005. You can imagine to become a lieutenant general, he also has an exceptionally distinguished record of service and command in very, very many levels of the Marine Corps, including the commanding general of the 1st Marine Division. In his last position, of course, he served as Director of Operations of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Snider.
Thank you, Bob. It's a delight to be back with Foreign Policy Research Institute. It's my first time participating with the Reserve Officers Association, but I appreciate the opportunity not only to discuss a subject that I think is vital, but to also spend the day with some colleagues that I haven't seen for a while. This is a remarkable collection, and the organizers of the conference are to be complimented on the group of people that they have gotten to take some time to talk about this. My topic is a little bit different. This panel is the fourth panel of the day. We've worked our way down to a single issue as opposed to a broad set of issues. My qualifications to speak about this topic do not come from my military service. I left the military profession about 1990 when I was moved from the active roles to the retired roles. It took me a year to certify in a new profession. And ever since then, I've been studying professions, military professions. So I want to spend about the first 10 minutes of my talk putting us all on one framework about how to think about modern competitive military professions. I say this because when I teach, lecture, write, there is an immense amount of misinformation about professions and misunderstanding. You'll notice one word that I no longer use in my vocabulary is the word professionalism. I recommend that for all of you. There is the noun profession, and we can talk about that in a characterological way, and there are individuals called professionals, and we can talk about them. But professionalism is in the mind of the beholder, and in those conversations we speak right by each other all the time, without ever getting to the specifics that will allow us to be either developmental or policy relevant. So I want to talk a little bit about professions. I want to do that in the context of civil-military relations. And the first chart that you're looking at shows the 4 relationships in civil-military relations. And in fact, there is a relationship in there between relationship A of civilian leaders to military leaders, and that's what we spent the last panel talking about. How corrosive has the Iraq War been on that relationship at the nexus? But the nexus, the issue of civilian control, as some people call it, is not the totality of civil-military relations. There's at least 4 sets of relations there, only one of which is military to military. And I'm as vitally interested in the military to military one as I am any in civil-military relations, although I research and teach there also. I'm interested in what is in the large orange circle. How do we think about military professions and their role in this society, where obviously they're a subset of the society, and the elites of the military interact with the elites of the society. And that is the civil-military nexus. That's the military and media. That's any number of things that we could talk about, but I want to reduce your focus to the orange circle. And here's what the orange circle looks like. Professions are defined by their expert knowledge. Let me say that again. The currency of a profession is its expert knowledge. What is the boundary around it? What's the content of it? What are the subdivisions of it? How do you know it's expert? I would submit that under that definition, there are at least 3 military professions in America, and I have written that there is an emerging 4th military profession. There is an Army profession of land combat, there is a maritime profession, an aerospace profession, and there is an emerging joint profession around the expert knowledge of how do you conduct joint warfare in a particular strategic command and control and intelligence architecture. And that expert knowledge is not the expert knowledge of the services. It is a different expert knowledge, and it's now documented that that knowledge is beginning to create its own. Well, if it is, where do the professionals come from for that profession? And we've already identified one significant disconnect in future American civil-military relations. The dotted line is also important. Professions certify their professionals. It took me a year before the academic board at West Point would certify me as a professor. I mean, they were really nit about it. They checked every little thing. What had I done? Where had I published? How much had I taught? Why should I be a professor? That's what professions do. It's called certification. How are the military professions certifying their professionals today? How does every soldier's mother and father know that the captain commanding the company is certified to lead Americans in combat? How do we do that in the military? I would submit that if you're promoting 98% of the captains to major, the promotion system is not a certification. So then what is the certification? How do we know a colonel is competent to command a brigade in combat? These are issues for military professions to resolve for themselves. But I only point out to you that there are a lot of people involved with the military and a lot of military voices. There are only few voices that are truly professional. Those people who still are practicing the profession. Now, what do we produce? I study the Army profession. Incidentally, the naval profession and the aerospace profession have not been studied in the last 40 years to my knowledge. When I initiated study with funds from private foundations to study the Army profession, it had not been studied in 30 years. 1970 was the last official study. We initiated a study in 1998, published the first book in 2002, published the second book in 2005. We've now reinitiated the study of Army as profession. But that's about all we've done. It's an immensely difficult process. How to think about professions. There's 3 ways you can organize any productive activity in a society. I'm speaking of ideal types now. Much as Huntington spoke of ideal types, as sociologists speak of ideal types. You can organize productive work under a business, set of market forces, a bureaucracy, or a profession. Every society gets to choose how its work is to be done. Remember, the society chooses if you are a profession, not the profession. If anybody thinks the American society doesn't know a difference when it looks at the military between a profession and a non-profession, just look what happened to the Army after Aberdeen Proving Ground. Behave like a bureaucracy, we'll treat you like a bureaucracy. And the Army got the back of the hand from the American society, and they were told how to do basic training in congressional statute. Their autonomy was stripped from them, one of the biggest identities of a profession. Expert knowledge, autonomy to practice. Or you can have this third way, what I'm talking about, professions. One of these 3 logics. The difficulty of what we have been talking about here today is that the military professions are not pure professions. They are, in fact, both bureaucracy and profession. They are structured as a hierarchical bureaucracy. They want to be professions. And when I teach this subject to the general officer classes and other places that I lecture at the War College this week, the bottom line of this discussion is very straightforward to say. Who determines at any point in time if a military profession is a profession or a bureaucracy? The answer is very straightforward. The colonels and the generals. That's it. Nobody else has the power or the authority to make the organizational culture one in which professionals can survive. because the colonels and generals control the major management structures of the bureaucracy, and it's all there together, bureaucratic and hopefully professional. Captains, majors, and lieutenant colonels just can't do that. Here's the difference. Some stark contrast between profession and bureaucracy, and yet the challenge to the military, one half of this civil-military relationship, the challenge of the military is what's dominating? Is profession dominating bureaucracy and we're really behaving as a profession? Or is bureaucracy dominating? Notice the aspect of profession: expert knowledge, lifelong learning, practice by humans. Professionals just use technology. They're not driven by technology. The quintessential practice of a profession, as I'll show you in a minute, is the repetitive exercise of discretionary judgment. Think of a young officer going down the street in Baghdad on patrol. How many times will she make a decision? No computer out, no formula out, just abstract knowledge in the head. Exactly the same way a doctor diagnosing and treating in a clinic, or a lawyer sitting in the office writing a case brief. The exercise repetitively of discretionary judgment. That's what professionals do. And that's what we want professionals doing. And only if there is a certain culture, atmosphere, environment, command climate, can they do that. Otherwise, they will be thwarted in that effort and will be conformed into the mold of a bureaucrat. The new theory of professions from Andrew Abbott, this is how it looks on a chart. Now, probably for most people in this room, the last time you studied professions was Huntington in 1957. I'm working now on a book that is a 50-year reprise of Huntington. Well worth doing. And much of what he said is good, accurate, true, and also flawed. And so how much of that we understand for today and how much is applicable for today, that's what we're working on this other project that I'm working on. All professions have jurisdictions where they practice, and if you look on the chart at the top, these are the negotiated jurisdictions done in the joint staff by the military departments, and this is where all military professions today practice. Can they practice equally in all four domains? Do they have enough resources to be in all of those at once? Are they able to negotiate out of one domain and into another? Are they doing too much in Homeland Security and not enough in stability ops? That's what colonels and generals determine, and that's why they're the only people that can make a profession, a military profession, a profession and not a bureaucracy. Now look below the dotted line. Every profession in America, medical, legal, theological, accountancy when it re-earns it, and the military, has two internal domains. You have to develop the expert knowledge of the profession. You have to develop it into professionals. We've taken the expert knowledge of military professions and put it in four baskets. The military technical, how do you fight wars? The moral ethical, how do you fight wars rightly? The way the American people expect them to be fought. The political social or the political cultural, how do you operate in other cultures? Like OSD, like the Joint Arena, like Iraq, like NATO, like the interagency discussion that we had this morning. How comfortable, adaptable, and capable are military professionals with that knowledge? Clearly one of its weakest knowledges. Then the last knowledge is quintessentially that of a profession. How do you develop humans? Because professions do their work humanly. The repetitive exercise of discretionary judgment. What does the map of one profession's knowledge look like? I know you can't read the little words, but let me just note for you that if it's green, in our two studies, this is what we told the Army, this is your core expert knowledge. Notice how little of the knowledge down the left-hand side of the page is green. There are only few things that are absolutely core to a land combat profession. Some are joint, and then as you get over to the right, there are areas that we can draw from society, and there's expertise that you can, in fact, contract out, and some you can contract in. Sadly, in both books, we concluded that the Army was contracting out willy-nilly, with no reference to the map of expert knowledge. Why? Because the Army didn't have a map of its expert knowledge. This was created by an Army scholar. There is no map of the Army's expert knowledge, and I haven't found one from either of the other military professions. If you don't know the boundary of your expert knowledge, and you can't predict what expert knowledge the client is going to want 6 years down the road, what kind of problems do you induce in a military profession? Just what happened in Baghdad in 2003. The profession got to Baghdad in 2003, and the client said, do counterinsurgency. And the profession said, I can't do that. I don't have any expert knowledge. And I have no professionals expert in the practice because I have no expert knowledge. See, that's what strategic leaders of professions, they have to look at the expert knowledge of the profession now and 6 years in the future to 10, create the knowledge, develop it in humans so it can be practiced when the client wants it, not when the profession wants it. That's the role of strategic leadership of professions. Expert knowledge, development of professionals, negotiation of jurisdictions. Now, that's a fundamentally different way of looking at professions that I would submit before I started this discussion that you had in your head. Incidentally, if you look at one of the services today and say, is this service a profession? Where would you look? I've just given you the answer. Are they creating new expert knowledge? Are there any military professions in Europe today? There are only 2 militaries in Europe creating new expert knowledge. The rest of them are obedient military bureaucracies. That's what military professions morph into when the strategic leaders of professions take their eye off the ball and stop looking at expert knowledge, developing humans, and negotiating jurisdictions. So, there's the quintessential practice. Now let's get to the topic of today. Here's a chart of military dissent prepared by 2 fellows, colleagues at the War College, Lenny Wong and Doug Lovelace. It's on their website if you're interested, the Strategic Studies Institute. How do we think about dissent now that we have a different picture of what a profession is? Now on this chart, Lenny and Doug have listed 8 ways that military officers or leaders may dissent, and they have listed them in quadrants with kind of their take on how you might expect military leaders to dissent, depending upon the resistance to their expertise from civilian leaders and how grave the threat is of national security. This is a 2-factor analysis. This is putting the issue of dissent primarily in the policy world. Is the policy, the issue over which they are dissenting, vitally important to the safety of the Republic? And do you have any chance the civilian leaders are going to listen to you when you go back the 2nd and 3rd and 4th time? And notice in the upper right-hand quadrant, higher threat to security, higher expected resistance, they have listed more forms of dissent and the really difficult forms of dissent, going all the way up to resignation. The most extreme form of dissent. Now, this is a 2-factor analysis. Since I'm someone who studies professions, I tend to prefer to think about a different way of thinking about dissent. And before I show you the chart, let me introduce you to 2 other ideas. Why do professions exist? Professions exist to do that for society which they cannot do for themselves and without which society cannot flourish. Stop and think about that. If the society can do it for yourself, you don't need a profession. But if it's necessary for the society to flourish, like be well, like be secure, and the society cannot do for itself, then it may organize that work under a profession and give the profession great autonomy. And we've been sitting here today talking back and forth about how much autonomy should the military have? And how do we want them to exercise that autonomy in civil-military relationships? I would submit to you that that relationship between the profession and the society that it's defending is a deeply moral relationship. And that therefore the person considering dissent has to use a moral calculus, not just a policy calculus that's on the chart. They have to use a moral calculus to determine whether or not they're going to participate in dissent. This is not personal policy analysis. This is the moral calculus between a professional and a client. And in that sense, I think that there's a different framework. I would use this framework. I think military professions in America have 3 principal trust relationships that they are responsible for maintaining. And again, who is responsible in the military? The colonels and the generals. They are the strategic leaders of the profession. The responsibility, the moral responsibility, rests with the profession. The strategic leaders are the professionals that are responsible for executing that moral responsibility, and I'd say there's three. There's one with the client. The client is defenseless if the profession cannot behave as a profession when the client wants it. Not 2 years later, after you've fumbled a counterinsurgency campaign at great expense for 2 years. That was a conspicuous failure by the strategic leaders of the military professions, that we did not have either the knowledge or the expertise at the time that it was needed. The second set of trust relations are the interpersonal relationships that occur at the civ-mil nexus. Peter alluded to some of those he's experienced at the NSC. I served at the NSC in 2 different administrations. Both administrations happened to be eras of great comity between the military and their civilian leaders. It was remarkable to go to a meeting of the Joint Chiefs with President Reagan. The comity was absolutely palpable in the room. High degree of mutual respect. And when Admiral Crowe gave a recommendation for the chiefs, the president turned and asked the service chiefs, Al, what do you think about that? And General Gray had no difficulty whatsoever giving the president an absolutely unvarnished response that flatly disagreed with what Bill Crowe had just said. But that could happen in the room. So I was privileged to work at this level of trust, but it is an interpersonal set of relationships, and it's between people who know each other and respect each other and build the relationship. But that's different than the relationship with the public. And then there's the trust with the juniors. Now this goes to building a profession. Now I'm looking at the military-to-military relationship, and one of the central trust items strategic leaders are responsible for, and if you read Paul Yingling's article, you can understand what he is arguing against. There's always some degree that in hierarchy that juniors disagree with seniors. Maybe now that's becoming a little wider than it should be. So this is the third trust relationship of any strategic leader of a profession. What I advocated in my paper, and I'll close with this point, is that strategic leaders of professions, because of these 3 unique trust relationships, should go down those factors on the left side of this matrix and ask themselves the question, and then evaluate each of these relationships and say, now, what's the gravity of the issue? Is this really an issue that is grave with respect to national security? Here I agree with Lenny Wong and Doug Lovelace entirely. This is the start point. If the issue is not grave, there should be no consideration of dissent. The second one is much more tricky, and the second one is probably least well understood, so let me take a minute to talk about it. The second issue is, what is the relevance of the exact point of disagreement over which the professional is preparing to dissent? What's the relevance of that issue to the expert knowledge of the profession? Not the personal knowledge of the individual, the expert knowledge of the profession. Remember, members of professions have an obligation to the client in 2 ways. The first obligation is to be able to practice, protect the client when they want to be protected. But the second obligation to the client is also the obligation to the expert knowledge. There is a moral space inside professions. A number of ethicists believe, and I agree with them, and incidentally, this is a topic of increasing research right now. There is a moral space inside professions where professionals are morally obligated to profess. That's where the word comes from. And if the issue in debate is core, spot on within what they are obligated to profess, then that's a very strong grounds for considering dissent. If it's a relevance to their expertise that is only tangential, or if it's something that they're personally interested in but is not in the realm of expertise at all, he was micromanaging. Come on. What was it about the disagreement in this administration between the civilian leaders and the military leaders that rested solely in the core of the military expertise? And I think if you read the records, there were some. So anyway, the moral space of the professional, absolutely the second thing to consider. Third, what's the degree of sacrifice in the act of dissent? This is probably most important for the juniors. Juniors expect their leaders to sacrifice for them. Why not? The juniors are sacrificing for the mission. This is the ethic of all the services. If this is a dissent by an individual with no personal sacrifice involved, then it's going to ring rather hollow with juniors. And the same for the timing of the dissent. If a moral decision is made by a professional, a moral decision that I must dissent from this action because of either the relevance of the knowledge, the gravity to the nation, then that dissent should occur immediately. Why wait? Once you have a moral obligation, moving from moral intention to moral agency is a problem for all professionals. But people who look at professions expect professionals to be able to move from intentionality to agency far faster than other people. That's why they're professionals. That's what the ethic of the profession holds. We want our leaders. We reward audacity in battle. We reward initiative. Now, there is a time for thoughtful reflection. But the timing, once the moral decision is made to dissent, I would submit, the act of dissent should follow quite rapidly thereafter. And the last point that I'm sure every person who considers dissent automatically thinks of, but I put it up here anyway. How does this fit in the pattern of leadership that I have developed in the service over the years? Is this going to be seen as authentically who I am? Or is this going to be seen and therefore misinterpreted by its inauthenticity? As you well know, the newer theories of leadership are now entitled theories of authentic leadership. The theories based on mutual risk sharing, etc., which also speak to the degree of sacrifice and the timing. But this is an issue that only the person can resolve for themselves. But I would say that any uniformed officer, active or retired, considering an act of dissent, has to understand quite clearly what are the three trust relationships that they hold in their hand. They're stewards of these by who they are. Do I want to take these trust relationships and erode them by this act of dissent, or am I going to reinforce them? And the analysis I would submit is down the left-hand side. So where do I come out on this? Let me summarize quite clearly. I think any officer, active or retired, who can use this moral calculus and say to themselves, it is necessary in the short term, because of factor A and B, that the costs that are going to be incurred in factors C, D, and E, this is a moral calculus, then I think they should dissent. And I think the professional military ethic based on this calculus needs very little evolution at all to endorse this kind of professional dissent. In fact, when I look back at the revolt of the generals, my take is that I'm struck with how little it accomplished in the short term. I'm struck in the midterm with how far we have moved beyond it. Therefore, I see no reason for any limits on dissent, professional dissent, that is arrived at by this type of moral calculus. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Snider. Our first commentator will be General Newbold, who came to the attention of many of us in April of 2006 with the Time magazine article, which has been characterized as a fully throated critique of the war in Iraq. General Newbold.
Thank you, Bob. Is this microphone on? I was hoping not. No. As Bob said, I was invited here because I am on that small group called the Revolting Generals. It'll be interesting to go over some of what went into this with you because there are a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings. Because I don't really know the other generals who revolted, save one. But I I do know a lot about my case and the case of one other officer. I also was, as Dean Atchison said, present at the creation. I was in the rooms and in the councils, and I know what went on, and we can talk about that. Also, I think Don Snider's matrix, the last slide he showed, was a good benchmark. And if you like, I can go into my personal case on that. But in providing my remarks, which I hope will be very short, I used the questions that were posed by FPRI as to how I should address my remarks. And I'll run through them, as I said, briefly. What is the line on offering advice? The first point I would make is I don't believe that civilian control is in dispute. I don't recall in public or private any member of the armed forces ever questioning the absolute authority of civilian leadership. The advice I received as a very junior officer remains valid to me. And that is, when you confront an issue, offer the best advice you have. That advice will either be taken or rejected. If either way, as long as you wear the uniform, your duty, even sacred duty, is to obey that direction to the very limits of your professional ability. The issue here, though, and why you're having this conference on civil-military relationships, is that a small number of retired officers, senior officers, chose to speak out on an issue of some gravity. The suggestion then is that no matter how egregious the policy, no matter how terrible the consequences, that it is inappropriate for individuals no longer wearing the uniform who have become citizens to speak out. I'm reminded of the anecdote about General Tony Zinni. When a previous administration, a Democratic administration, suggested that we should launch our own insurgent activities in the south of Iraq, he counseled against it and referred to it as a bay of goats. And the National Security Advisor at the time challenged him, "What gave you the right to speak up?" And he said, I believe it was the Constitution. So before you limit too strictly the rights of individuals who have served a long time, whether they're in the CIA, the State Department, the Department of Commerce, and otherwise, consider how you're ostracizing or fencing off an element of society that may be important. The next question was, how much can or should the military speak out? Well, I've already given some of my thoughts on it. I want to make a couple of additional points. First of all, in my view, the military in uniform should never speak out in public. I would make a caveat to that. It's already been ascribed the duty of a professional when called before Congress. And I can talk about that too. Let me describe those that chose to speak out. Let me broaden the group a little bit because it's generally limited to the revolting six. It's arguable that the most knowledgeable people about this region of the world from a military perspective were the former combatant commanders of Central Command. And if you look at the words and statements of a succession of them, from General Schwarzkopf through General Hoare, through General P, through General Zinni, what you'll find is a group that was deeply, deeply troubled what was happening. I'll make another point. I spent a lot of time with the senior officers of all of the services when I was the director of operations. And I can tell you the sense of mystery and, let's pardon the term, shock and awe over the senior officers about what was happening was pervasive. It was almost universal. From every service, the most senior officers coming to me, what in the world is going on? So the issue is not who thought that the policy was in question, but who did something about it. And your issue in this discussion on civil-military relations ought to include a discussion of those that sense something terribly flawed, and having served long in the service, know that those who pay the price have no voice. And what is their duty and what is their obligation? What are the ethical dimensions of serving both branches of the government? Oath is clear, in my view. The duty of a serving officer is to serve those appointed above over them to the best of their ability while you're in active service. And when the Congress calls and asks questions, it is equally your oath to give them honest answers. And as Representative Skelton said, that's a bigger problem than speaking out in private counsel. What are the obligations of senior officers to their seniors and to their juniors? Senior officers is as I've already stated. Frank, did you load that PowerPoint slide of mine?
No, sir.
You weren't able to? I'm an advisor to 4 different groups that support the wounded, and frankly, I counsel a couple of other groups. And in the 2 years that went by after my retirement, not every week, but virtually every week I went to Bethesda or Walter Reed. There's one that sticks in my mind. Sergeant Ziegel and his wife Renee. The picture that I forwarded over here was their wedding photograph. Now, Sergeant Ziegel made it through the war and recovered from the most massive burns in medical history. So it left him without facial features. It left him without a right arm. He went from being something out of Hollywood as a role model to something different out of Hollywood. And when from my friend General Tom Jones visited him down at Brooke Army Hospital at the Burn Center, and he was remarkably upbeat and positive. And his wife walked in, or his fiancée walked in for the first time, and General Jones could not imagine the shock that she must have felt. She had one question for the doctors. Will this delay our October wedding? The sacrifices that the juniors make, that we ask of them, is immense. They not only forfeit their futures and the possibility of even living, but most of them, particularly the reservists, give up fortunes. And what do they ask in return? A noble mission and leaders whose faith in them will be as strong as their faith in us. How much should officers be involved with the media? In my view, on active duty, they should only be involved with the media where it's part of their official duties and sanctioned as such while they're on active duty. But then they're citizens. And if you want to question that, we can do it on the break. Let me make another point about Sergeant Ziegel. In an interview in 2004, Jack McWethy from ABC News interviewed Secretary Rumsfeld. And he posed the question, war's been long and hard. Doesn't it bother you to see the long line of body bags coming back? Secretary Rumsfeld says, well, sure it does. Every one of them's a tragedy. But then he said, but remember, they're volunteers. When you want to know what it took for me finally to go from being such an inherently private person, when the rebuttal or the answer is it doesn't carry weight because they volunteered for it, then it crosses the line. You need to answer the question when you describe the civil-military relationships in academic terms or in policy terms. Is there not a line upon which any professional won't cross if the situation becomes egregious enough? If you know that those who pay the price will be the Sergeant Ziegels of the world and his wife Renee, 3,884 for over 30,000 casualties. When you see and you know that it's going to happen. So is the issue those that spoke out or those that didn't? I've spoken long enough. I'll leave it up to the questions to ask about my personal situation. And you can mark down your final grade based on Don Snider's report card. But now let me turn it over to Peter. The floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. I want to thank Mr. Luxembourg and Mr. Hoffman as well for the invite. Colonel Snider and General Newbold, I certainly feel light on the collar up here amongst such distinguished leaders. I was in Iraq in 2005, 2006. I was a National Guardsman before I joined the 101st Airborne on for their deployment from 05 to 06, and I still serve in the National Guard in New York. Believe the reason I'm here is as the executive director of Vets for Freedom. It's an Iraq and Afghanistan veterans organization that serves to communicate and elevate the stories of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans that aren't otherwise heard, to provide them a platform to talk about what they saw as experts in their particular lane and inform the American people about it. I think, so it's not necessarily dissenting, but it is speaking up at the sort of junior level. We're not, and it's all based on experience, I believe he called it expert knowledge. It's not our guys pontificating about whether Iran should be the next step. It's how do you implement counterinsurgency at the neighborhood level as a lieutenant, as a company commander. If you want to talk to someone about Afghanistan, we've got a slew of Afghan vets that understand the situation there. You want to talk about Haditha, we've got a Marine Corps JAG officer that dealt with it directly. The kinds of people that have direct expert knowledge about particular issues. And that's what we've pushed for in staying inside that lane. There was always a temptation, and there were always requests to go beyond that, to comment on situations that are, to use a simple term, above our pay grade, and that happens. And I'd be lying if I said that didn't. I think there's a key distinction to be made between junior officers and colonels and generals, one of which is timing. I think if I had to highlight one square of the 5 factors when considering dissent, I would focus on timing. I think when you make a decision about whether or not to speak up says a lot about your moral character. And I'm not speaking. I'm just speaking based on experience. But with a junior officer, there isn't that outlet to sort of resigning as a staff sergeant isn't going to do a whole lot. Resigning as a second lieutenant isn't necessarily going to send that statement. But coming home when you're retired or back as a citizen soldier, sharing your experience, I think can have an impact on that community or people who are making important decisions about whether they should or should not support current strategies in theater. And there are certainly been questions recently on this with sort of the New York Times 7, the members of the 82nd Airborne that penned that op-ed piece. I think that in my opinion, crosses a line when you've got active duty soldiers writing op-eds in the New York Times. We encourage our guys who are no longer either retired or in the National Guard and Reserves and back to be involved, but I think there's a very fine line, and we can talk some particulars on that. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the timing of Dissent, and I'll keep this brief, and particularly the relationship between what happens with Dissent and how it relates to junior officers. I think we've talked a lot about the public, but with junior officers and junior NCOs and their trust relationship with superiors. And I wanted to quote a piece that was written by one of our founders of Vets for Freedom. His name is Staff Sergeant David Bellavia. He is recipient of the Silver Star and has been nominated for the Medal of Honor for his actions in Fallujah. And he was actually a subordinate. He was actually in the 1st Infantry Division and served under General Batiste for 33 months, who he, in the piece, applauds and has more good words to say about than anything else, and sort of his leadership in wartime, and is very respectful in his assessment. But I think he actually wrote this recently, and it touches on some of the questions anecdotally that were raised correctly by Colonel Snider. He says, when Batiste qualifies his remarks on talk shows and commercials by evoking his being a commander of the Big Red One as a platform for credibility of such commentary, it makes it personal for a junior NCO. And he goes on to say that I believe it's sort of self-serving and saddened that he continues to represent himself as an ambassador with the political statements that he makes. How many press conferences can we Google to find archived transcripts of General Batiste and Secretary Rumsfeld standing side by side discussing how things were going magnificently? Or what world exists that we are to believe a war plan that he helped formulate is now fatally flawed only after he leaves command? So you've got a staff sergeant that bled and saw his men die, making comments about this command relationship and the trust level of what happens when generals, retired generals or others, comment. He also says he told us then that we were involved in a noble defense of our nation and our homeland. What then now? And I think these are the disillusionment that can come with junior officers, junior NCOs coming back and hearing from former leaders who did not have the courage to speak up at the time about something that a very contentious issue. I think that's something our Army and our Marine Corps is going to have to deal with, and I certainly applaud what I see as incredibly courageous actions taken by Lieutenant General Newbold in the face of a decision that's based, I think, largely on timing and whether or not it's a relevant act of dissent. So it's healthy, but I think it needs to be, as long as it's genuine, which I believe will be checked by public scrutiny, and as long as it's in the sort of the legal bounds of what the military provides. I think also, as far as Vets for Freedom is concerned, the conversation is informed and improved with the inclusion of direct actors. And the question I always ask is, in this sort of domestic conversation we have, and I believe it's a war of perception, larger, more so than it is anything else, should we cede as citizen soldiers, as retired officers, as retired NCOs, should we cede the information battle to the ill-intentioned and the uninformed? Or should we go out and talk about what we saw and the actions that are being taken now and the strategies that are being used now? Not everyone's ill-intentioned and not everyone's uninformed. I'm not saying that, but I think it only serves to add to the conversation and the substance of the conversation when soldiers come back. As long as they're doing it with the right spirit and with the right intentions, it's nonpartisan, and they're doing it within the regulations, I think it adds to the conversation. But before going publicly, I also think there's a responsibility to do everything within the organization before advocating without, to ensure that you've sent those after-action reviews up your chain of command, that you've talked to the people you can talk to within your purview to make the necessary changes before deciding, all right, now it's time for me to speak out, or it's time for me to talk about how things are not going the right way. For me, that was doing the natural steps in 2006 when I'd come back from Samara through after action reviews, and then writing my own 10-page lessons learned memo of what we did in Samara and how we needed to be fighting a classic counterinsurgency, and we weren't, and we didn't have enough troops, and things weren't moving in the right direction, and this is why they weren't. And it was sort of disseminating it as far as wide as and I didn't know what I was doing, but I sent it to anybody that would read it. And to me, it was sort of ensuring that I did everything I could internally before deciding to sort of step up and say, you know what, we need to now take the steps necessary to sort of ratchet up the heat. And for me, that was writing a Wall Street Journal piece in October entitled "More Troops, Please." And that was sort of my first public pronouncement of the fact that, I think there are changes that may need to be made. In conclusion, I don't want to go on too long because we've got some incredible panelists here. I agree with the assessment of Colonel Snider. I wouldn't go so far to say that there should be no restrictions, but a renewal of professionalism and certainly a reinforcement of professional ethics, or I shouldn't say professionalism, but professional ethics is important, and it needs to be maintained generation by generation within the Army and Marine Corps throughout the military. So that's for me, it's a very personal experience and has a lot to do with my own experience, but appreciate the academic assessment that Colonel Snider gave, and I think it's largely correct.
Well, thank you to both our commentators. I'd like to turn to Dr. Snider for a quick addition to his initial paper, and then we'll turn to questions.
I think the questions are far more important than anything I have to say. Let me make one qualification to my final statement. When I said no limitations on dissent, what I mean is no additional limitations. There are plenty of limitations on dissent right now. I'm not in the camp that says that this is a problem that we need to address with additional limitations. That's my point.
We're in the question period. Sir.
I have two questions for General Newbold. In your Time Magazine op-ed, you implied that those who didn't speak up the generals who didn't speak up were timid, did not show sufficient courage. My question is it possible that there were some generals who were courageous but disagreed with your strategic assessment? Or is it a necessary conclusion of your argument that anyone who is a military expert, who cares about the wounded, cares about the costs of the war, must also come to the same strategic conclusion that you came about the way the war should be conducted? My second question is, after you published your op-ed, there was a very thoughtful debate that was stirred. There was also probably some thoughtless debate in the blogosphere. But I read a number of thoughtful essays from scholars, including Dick Cohn and others, that addressed some of the downstream costs to future administrations' trust in their senior generals and asked questions about the timing. Was this necessary now? What was the reason for it now? It seemed to be triggered by Secretary Rice's sort of offhand comment about tactical errors rather than a more driven by some action-forcing event. And there was, in other words, a thoughtful debate. And I was wondering if after reading those thoughtful critiques of what you had done, has your thinking evolved at all? Or are you still basically where you were when you wrote that op-ed and where you are, what you just presented in your comments? Have you evolved in your thinking at all about the civil-military issues?
Two questions. The first one indicated that my objection was to those that didn't speak up because they were timid, and therefore those who supported the policy or disagreed with me were categorized otherwise. I had discussions with the most senior officers of every service and with all of the combatant commands on a daily basis. I'm not going to name names, that's up to those individuals, but I can tell you what I said before was it was nearly universal that there was enormous questioning about what we were doing and why. There were, to be sure, generals and admirals who believed that not only what we were doing, but how we were going about it, which was equally important, was the right thing. But in private conversations with members of the Joint Chiefs and with senior members of each of the services and the combatant commands, I know that there were great questions. The issue is not whether general officers should speak out or not. It's whether their voices should be provided in private. My article was not about the war, and it wasn't really even about Secretary Rumsfeld. It was about making voices heard, whether you're in support or in contradiction to policy. Now, as my thinking evolved since the article, I would disagree with most of the people in this room, I would suppose, particularly those that describe the corrosive effect. You can argue what the effect had been up to now, but I would suggest that if you talk to the senior officers in the Pentagon and the combatant commands now, and you describe the relationship with the civilian leadership now, that you would get a completely different view. And I think while it may not be as good as Don Snider described in a previous administration, I think it's excellent. Now, do I regret writing the article? No, I don't. Have I paid some personal price for that? You bet. Has my thinking changed on it? My only thinking is I've been a private person since that article too, until this discussion. And frankly, I regret coming here because I didn't know it'd be broadcast, and now I'm in the public again. But my thinking remains consistent with that article and with what I urge my fellow senior officers to do.
Before I get to the next question, Alan, are there any questions over the web?
Yeah, we have a question from Timothy Kern. In Rise of the book, in the book Rise of the Fighter Generals, then Major Mike Worden was very careful to work around dissent. In fact, the chapter critical of the U.S. Air Force leadership at the time was omitted due to command influence during the thesis defense phase of the writing. Has the leadership environment changed sufficiently such that professional writing can now be granted exempt status for academic purposes?
My answer would be yes. All anyone needs to know if they want to read military dissent is read Military Review or Parameters. I mean, 3-star generals are publishing articles routinely in Military Review and less so in Parameters. That's a bit more of a less operational, more theory and strategy of war type journal. But at least in the Army profession, there are plenty of places for active duty officers to write articles about what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. And to me, that's an absolutely healthy development inside the profession. It's exactly what should be doing. I would much prefer to see Paul Yingling's article in one of the military journals than in a more commercial journal. But that said, it still was a thoughtful piece written clearly in the spirit of, let's have a dialogue about this. Let's talk about this. This is what professionals do. So I find plenty of places for people to express opinions that can be considered dissenting opinions. But like most professionals, they probably just don't have a lot of time to write them, particularly when you're prosecuting a war. But I know of no strictures that you can't do that. Fact is, in the Army profession right now, obviously an example of General Petraeus, General Torelli, in Military Review, it's encouraged.
Sir.
Jim Kurtz from the Institute for Defense Analyses. The term corrosive has been used here today to describe the effects of the dissent, and it's one I've used myself, but not because of the relationship between their senior military and the civilian, but for what it says about the trust of military leaders and those above them and the chain between them and the secretary. When John Batiste called for the secretary to step down, it was a public repudiation of his faith in anybody above him in the chain of command. And so the question for you is, when you have dissent at that very senior level, what's the effect on the whole institution, on the profession, if you will, when intermediate leaders, the colonels and the generals that you said are the ones that make up the profession, indicate they don't trust those above them in the profession? I think you've already answered that.
So you can.
Okay.
I think it can be in some ways corrosive, and I cited the Batiste example specifically. If you don't feel like your senior officers believe in what they're committing to, or what they're committing you to, then it is going to be corrosive. And if you don't believe that they believe in the, if you don't believe that they believe in the mission, then why haven't they taken the steps necessary in that moment in time to stand up against it or to speak out again? I think it's a timing issue. For me, so much of this is a timing issue, and whether or not as a again, I've never been a senior officer, but as a senior officer, whether or not you have the courage in that moment to make a statement or make the statements necessary, the actions necessary to stop something you see as immoral or incorrect, and because at the junior level that option is not available.
Yes, sir.
Dick Cohn. I want to thank, at least on my own behalf, General Newbold for coming and becoming public here, for clarifying some points in your essay, because I thought, as you know, some of those points did call into question civilian control and did raise the issue of public speaking out while on active duty. So I think you provide a public service by clarifying that. But there is one issue that I'd like, if you would not mind addressing, and that's the issue of when it's proper for a retired officer to go public with their disagreements. It's a long tradition of officers retired to write memoirs, and some very frank memoirs about what happened during their active service. But when that administration that they served is still in office, it's a distinction that I've tried to make that I think does to some degree poison the civil-military relationship in the future, because it may broadcast to successive administrations that they can't trust the senior military that they are interacting with not to go public while they're still in office, and thus affect the politics of the war and, in fact, the politics of the next election. Is it at all possible that officers should wait a suitable period of time to go public with what happened while they were on active duty?
I think that's a good question and a good point. And I'd like to provide two thoughts. Number one, I think the circumstances have to be extraordinary for a retired senior officer to speak out. I think these circumstances were extraordinary. And I can get into refining the list, if you like. But it should be so rare as to raise the kind of level of attention that it did this time. If I was to put it in quantitative terms, I would say that 99% of the time it's generally inappropriate. And I'm troubled by retired officers that align with a party, either one of them. But as for waiting, I concede a bias there. And my bias has to do with the visits to Walter Reed and Bethesda. And it bothers me to impugn that the reason I would do it have something to do with anything else. Because the consequences and the price was being paid dearly. As I chose silence because I'm a private person. And it was only after a long period of time that I mustered up the courage to speak out, because in our profession, it's just not done. particularly when people are in the fight.
Alan, do you have any other questions?
Daphne Bonneau from the France Press Agency asked of the panelists, what do you think of General Sanchez's very critical remarks about Iraq last Friday?
I won't speak in public about his remarks. Just to shorten the...
Yeah, and I don't want to be coy either, but I haven't read his remarks. And I certainly don't trust what the journalists tell me his remarks were. So until I get to read the transcript, I'm simply unprepared to comment.
I've read a good portion of it, and I think it's not all reported. I think a lot of it talks about the giant disaster that it has unfolded, but if you read the first part of the transcript, it talks about how we need to be there and we need to be engaged and we need to continue and we can't immediately pull out troops. That's oversimplifying it, but I don't think the media has necessarily done it justice.
Peter, I have a question for you. You're a junior officer on the panel. What was the impact on you, and if you can speak for some of your colleagues, when you heard distinguished senior officers speak out in dissent about the war that you were in? What was the impact on you?
In all honesty, in the fight, not much. Because when you're engaged in a battle space or with your men, I mean, your mission is your focus, and I frankly didn't listen all that much to them unless it was my colonel or my chain of command talking about what we need to be doing. So, and I think that's universal. I really do. In any combat zone you're in, I mean, you hear it in the chow hall or you hear it wherever you are about people speaking out or members of Congress making statements about your mission. And while it's frustrating and it's agitating, it's not something that engulfs you in the fight. I think it's when you come back and then you realize that your buddies are still over there and they're maybe fighting underneath a chain of command that doesn't believe in it, or they're fighting with a Congress that isn't giving them the support. That's when I think it bubbles over and leads veterans and others to speak out.
Sir.
Before we run out of time, I want to make a comment about timing because it's been a central plank of what we've described here. In December of 2001, after the fall of the Taliban, there were a couple of things that occurred in the Pentagon in which I was directly, personally involved, in which it became obvious to me that there was a group within this administration who were undeterrable for war. I saw virtually all intelligence other than the presidential daily brief going on, and I was personally aware of what they were doing to intelligence. And then immediately after that, I offered my resignation. It was not accepted. So what I tried to do then was formulate an alternative strategy within the Joint Staff. And that idea perhaps didn't have merit, but it certainly wasn't accepted. And then we began a series of war games to stress the ability of the armed forces to conduct what we were undertaking. And up through that point, my hope was that greater reason would prevail, and that the statements coming out of the White House about we will give diplomacy a chance were true. When the continued statements I heard from inside the Pentagon revealed that that was not their intent, I resigned or retired. So if timing is an issue, you fill out the report card. Started in December of 2001 and ended up with my retirement on 1 November 2002. The second point, I didn't do enough, and I made it clear in that Time article. I wish I had done more. I would have never spoken out in public. Ever. But I did speak out in private. Not enough. And shame on me.
Colonel Dalzell, and we'll have one more question over here from this gentleman. And if you're deferring to the gentleman, then you can go first.
You're standing first.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Dan Smith, I've already been up once. Congressman Ike Skelton talked about telling the truth when you come before Congress. It may be because the war is going so badly, but I have the impression that the American public is not necessarily aware that when the 3 and 4 stars go before Congress, they are presenting, and at least this is my interpretation, the administration's policy and presenting their view of whether that policy can be carried out with the forces that are made available. Then the whole thing collapses when the policy is shown, as General Newbold said, to be two-faced in terms of what is said at one point and then what comes out later.
Sir, do you have a quick question?
Yeah,
You can
the question, I guess, is how do we get around this perception problem when a general officer is asked his personal opinion as opposed to presenting the policy of the administration and whether or not the policy can be supported?
By the time you're a senior officer in the military and you've been around Washington a while, beyond the corrosive effects of that, it's generally understood how you act when you're on the Hill. And the first prescription's pretty clear. You support administration policy. The second one is equally clear. When you are essentially demanded to speak your personal opinion, then you have to do that. Now, epiphany. Members of Congress are politicians. They do some of this for theater. They are aware on their side of the table that if you want personal advice, honest and uncensored, then talk to them one-on-one. It could have been done. There were members of Congress fully aware on both sides of the aisle on what was happening. And the momentum of public opinion was such at the time that they made a political calculus. So I spoke to a group, one of the most conservative groups on the Hill, Republicans. I won't identify it further than that. They invited me over there for lunch. I gave my remarks to them. I was retired by then, I have to clarify. And I was astounded. There must have been 12 or 14 in the room, and they all were venomous about how they agreed with me, which begged the question, why didn't they speak up and speak out?
Colonel Dalzell.
When I arrived in the Joint Staff in 2003, one of the things I learned as a staff officer was that not many months before, an example of military leadership had left the J3, who was remembered for his honesty and integrity, and his ability to speak truth to the power in a way that showed discretion and insight. The general. So when he spoke, when the Time magazine piece came out, I could see that it was an act of authenticity, not of self-serving or political promotion, anything like that. And it gets back to what Colonel Snider mentions as the fifth criterion for the decision-making process of, is it an authentic act of leadership? And so the question for the panel is, how do we, as those of us that are colonels and generals now, how do we create such authentic leaders who can make those kinds of decisions throughout their career to prepare themselves for the highest level input into the policy process, as you've demonstrated by your career, sir?
Well, my answer is you start very early. That's obviously what I've dedicated the last 15 years of my life to. But I think you have to create in officers an identity of who they are, not what they do. This is not about job. This is not about work. This is about being. Being always precedes doing. And if there is not character in being, there will not be character in doing. So you have to have an identity-based form of character and leadership development. We have a very deficient language in policy studies and civil military relations. We talk about PME. We should take that out of our language and throw it away. Education is not the issue. It's the development of the whole human. We want to develop leaders holistically. Part of that's education, part of that's training, part of that's experiential learning, and part of that, lo and behold, is human spirituality. How did we win the Battle of the Bulge? Soldiers were inspired. We're so politically correct today, we can't even talk about it. So my answer is, this is about officer and non-commissioned officer or leader development. You must do it holistically, you must start early, and you will utterly fail if you don't have role models in place where they can see it lived day by day. Not so hard.
Dr. Snider, I was going to pose a question to you. It's very similar to what Colonel Dalzell just said, but given your recent experience teaching both at West Point and now up at the Army War College, is there hope?
Oh, by all means. By all means, there is hope. Generation Y officers are absolutely remarkable. Let me leave it there.
Peter?
I can't add much to that. It is about example, and I just wanted to clarify that my statements before were not meant to indict General Batiste. I don't know him. I've never met him. I was just speaking on the sort of the perception amongst junior officers or some that I know. So it's in no way an indictment of him. I can't speak to whether they were authentic or not or had ulterior motives. I have no idea. But I think it has to do with leaders and setting an example by what you do and not just by what you say.
And our last question.
Dick Cohn again, and General Newbold raised an issue that I think would be helpful if Don Snider and General Newbold addressed, and that is the issue of resignation. It's a troubling one, I think, for those of us who study civil-military relations, because we have trouble distinguishing when one officer resigns or asks for retirement or reassignment, how that can carry over when several at a time might do that. And if I understand General Newbold as a 3-star and the J3 could ask to just not be participating anymore in this action, but if the chairman had done so, or the chairman, the vice chairman, and several others, would that not have been a direct kind of assault on the policy and thus civilian control, and put the follow-on leaders in great jeopardy of not being able to lead the force? Now, I tell my students that that's in effect what the left wanted the military to do during Vietnam. And so I worry about the growing acceptance of resignation as part of the professional ethic in terms of serving the country and perpetuating the system of government that we have.
It ought to bother you. It ought to bother you deeply that there would be acts like that, and I hope they never occur. But I would tell you that there was a time when counsel in private at a fairly large decibel level might have changed the course of events. I don't advocate changing the policy, the process, or the law. All of those are in place now. They give full power and authority for the Joint Chiefs of Staff or for combatant commanders to be heard. And if they do it early in the game, they can change the course. Later, when it's a matter of great drama, then the effects can be fairly dramatic. Lesson learned.
Dick, I appreciate your question because you and I have had this dialogue before, but the audience is not aware of it. You and I disagree on this point. Just as General Newbold said that an act of dissent by a strategic leader in a profession is in the 99% category, I think resignation or the threat of resignation is at the 99.9% category. I mean, this is ultimately in extremis that it should ever be considered. And we talk a lot about it, but people don't do it because it's immensely expensive. I mean, there went your retirement and all your benefits when you resign your commission. So this is probably 99.9. But my reason for wanting to leave it on the table is because I study professions. And for someone to look at a profession and say, we want to take off the table the option of resignation by professions, what you are telling them is, we want to treat you as a bureaucrat. We do not respect the moral space of your expert knowledge. There is nothing you ever need to profess over. Just be an obedient bureaucrat and go about your work. I think that is one of the worst prescriptions for the future of civil-military relations. We want as fine a professions with as deep expert knowledge as we can get. And if you want professions, then you grant the professionals the moral autonomy that their knowledge entitles them in your society. And that has to say that there is a small moral space in there in which they're entitled to take the extreme act of dissent.
The problem I see with it is finding out and having officers perceive when it is the 99.9 situation. And a misstep in that calculation can have really toxic effects long time.
I agree, but we trust the same officers with the lives of American sons and daughters. In the balance, that toxicity is pretty minor.
What a remarkable panel, what a remarkable day. Please join me in thanking the panel. It's now my privilege on behalf of President Paul Grosskreutz of ROA and the 70,000 members of the Reserve Officers Association who represent all the reserve components to thank all of our panelists and speakers today and you, the audience, for coming. We deeply appreciate it. And I'd like to call on Dr. Harvey Zuckerman from the Foreign Policy Research Institute for some closing comments. Thank you all again.
I, like many of the people in this audience, am condemned to attend many conferences. And the concluding remarks at such conferences sometimes indicate that the person delivering the remarks spent the day in, shall we say, peaceful repose, rather than in any comprehension of what took place. That certainly was not possible today, both because of the importance of the issue and the excellence of the presentations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to conclude simply with 5 themes that emerged for me, at least, from this discussion. The first is civil-military relations are inevitably the consequence of the frictions built into our constitutional government. And the difficulty there is that very often the military can get caught up in that friction, particularly between the executive and the Congress, and we certainly heard from Representative Skelton somewhat to that effect. Second, that this friction in the latest phase of our history has been harmful. The situation wasn't very good before Iraq. It's certainly now materially worse than it was. The third is that this is partly because we lack the capabilities, both military and civilian, to conduct the kind of conflict that we have found ourselves conducting in Iraq, and that is in part why these frictions have been exacerbated. Fourth, if we're going to put it together, we explored different aspects of the civil-military relationship, not only control, but the views of society, the participation, and finally, of course, the professional aspect of the military. And here, finally, fifth, what was stressed is that the military profession involves expert knowledge, a discretionary judgment, and in the moral sense, a certain obligation to profess. And we heard from General Newbold his particular personal obligation to profess and the timing of that profession. And so in the end, ultimately, a mismanaged relationship between the civilians and the military puts in jeopardy not simply the profession of the statesman, but ultimately the profession of the military itself. And with that, I want to thank you all for attending, and we hope that you found it as very worthwhile. And we look forward to seeing you again, because we're not going to let go of this particular issue. Thank you.